This week on Monero Talk is sponsored by Cake Wallet. Store, send, receive, and exchange your Monero safely on your iOS and Android too. Cake Wallet is open source, and you always control your own keys and seed. And by xmr.to. Anonymously exchange your Monero into Bitcoin and seamlessly send Monero to any Bitcoin address. Go to xmr.to or use it right in your Cake Wallet. Cake Wallet and xmr.to are trusted and verified by the Monero community. Monero Talk is also made possible from contributions by viewers and listeners like you.
This week on Monero Talk, we wrap up our 36C3 series. I first speak with Oweme. Oweme is a former open source software developer at CERN and CTO of Biddy, a Swiss cryptocurrency exchange. He currently co-organizes discussion groups and technical workshops around crypto economics. Oweme gave a talk on why forks happen and their consequences. In his talk, he discussed examples of forks in different social structures, from hunter-gatherer tribes and religious factions to open source projects, and particularly the crypto economic protocols that enable decentralized infrastructure. We discuss Ome's talk, and I ask him why Monero appears to be better than Bitcoin at avoiding contentious forks. Next, I speak with Francisco Cabanas, aka Articmine. Francisco holds a PhD in physics. He has actively researched and invested in cryptocurrencies since 2011 and focuses on the economic, social, regulatory, and long-term economic viability aspects of cryptocurrencies. Francisco has been a core team member of the Monero project since 2016. Articmine gave a talk on Monero's adaptive Blockweight approach to scaling. He compares Monero's adaptive approach versus Bitcoin's fixed Blockweight approach and its effects on scaling, and the impact of Monero's tail emission versus Bitcoin's cap supply on long-term network security. We discuss Articmine's talk and get into the weeds of Monero's scalability. My takeaway is, Monero needs to do a better job at explaining and advertising its ability to scale. Monero's transaction sizes may be 5 times larger than Bitcoin's because of the built-in privacy, but long-term, Monero is actually built better for scaling than Bitcoin. And that's ignoring the fact that Bitcoin has to essentially make extra transactions to mix coins in an attempt to achieve fungibility. I urge you to listen closely to Articmine's 36C3 talk and this interview with him to grasp the arguments for why Monero is ultimately better designed for scaling than coins like Bitcoin. Monero Talk starts now. All right. Oweme, thanks for coming on the show. How's it going?
Thank you, Doug.
How's the conference going?
It's been a lot of work this year. I've been organizing Swiss Crypto Economics Assembly. I had a talk this morning and a workshop now in the evening. So with this interview, this is the last busy thing that I have in the schedule.
And then you could just party, relax, listen to the other talks.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
I didn't have the chance to do much of that yet.
So I listened to your talk this morning. It was the sharp forks we follow, right? Is that
forks we follow? Yeah, that's it.
It was very interesting. How do you want to do like a quick summary of it, and then I'll ask you some questions about it?
Sure. So the talk was a social exploration on what forks are and what other examples we have of forks in human history. So I covered what a fork is in open source projects, what we mean by forks in blockchain, and what are the type of forks that we have. So soft forks, hard forks, and then within the hard forks, which ones are the problematic ones or the ones that I was focusing on, which are the contentious ones. And then what are the things that are that we are discussing about? What are the reasons for the split to be discussed? And at the same time, what are the things that brought people together? Why were they working on the same project at the beginning? So this opens a big discussion as to how communities come together. So just to give a bit of background of myself as well, just to contextualize this topic, I'm a software engineer. I've been working in open source development in the past and now again. And then I had like 2 years and a half working professionally in crypto. So I got fascinated by the topic of what does it mean that now there are two blockchains, now there are two currencies, and now the market cap of these two currencies combined are higher than they were before. So this has been a question that has been in my mind for a long time, and this was my first attempt to formalize a bit my ideas and try to share them with an audience. So yeah, I don't know if you want me to drill down into more specifics on the matter.
Well, yeah. Well, when I listened to your talk, it got me thinking. It got me thinking about Monero specifically, obviously. And what I find interesting about Monero is that while we upgrade every 6 months, I don't know if you're aware of that. We don't, you don't see contentious forks. There's been one or two attempts, but I think it's pretty interesting that Monero has managed to maintain this cohesive nature, and everybody's kind of staying on the same trajectory and track together and not forking off. And I was just wondering if you have any opinions as to why that might be the case for Monero.
So not being very close to the Monero community, so I don't know exactly what are the dynamics and I could say that it would say to me that maybe the community is well aligned ideologically and also technologically. Maybe the community agrees on what are the priorities of how the protocol and the software that implements the protocol should evolve. So maybe that's signaling some good practices on community management. But at the same time, you never know when a clique of the community will start thinking differently and they will feel compelled enough to start making a contentious proposal that will end up in a fork. So yeah, that's what I could say about it.
Do you think there's things that a community can do or should do to attempt to prevent forks?
So
contentious forks.
Again, having a clear vision is one thing, but then it opens the discussion about who is broadcasting that vision, and that taps into the discussions about decentralization and can we really decentralize all the things? Because you can say that the Ethereum community as well, it's less belligerent than the Bitcoin community internally. But at the same time, they have a more centralized leadership around Vitalik and the Ethereum Foundation. So maybe it even boils down to the community themselves discussing how far off do we want to shoot. Because another good argument could be that even communities that try to shoot away from the consensus of the protocol, they're also experimenting features and policies that are perceived as dangerous, and the community don't feel confident enough to implement them in the main chain, because there is at the end economic value attached to it. So people start getting scared and cautious. So you could say that communities that are more friendly to forks, maybe they're encouraging more experimentation and having more diversity of protocols. But if we wanted to have no forks, well, we could, again, like I did in the presentation this morning, an analogy with other forms of social organizations. Dictatorial regimes have a very strong allergy against dissent. So they will go, a colleague of mine says that it's proof of gulag. If you don't like what we're playing, then you will be repressed and there will be no forks. So do we really want to live in communities where we don't allow forks? That's an interesting discussion to have as well.
Yeah. I mean, once again, in terms of Monero, what I think is interesting about it is ultimately, if you really want this stuff to succeed, Monero or Bitcoin, whatever it may end up being, at the end of the day, it's a protocol that we're trying to get the world to adopt. And so ultimately, you don't want eventually, you want everybody to agree on ideally one protocol, right? Would be the most ideal, right? For various reasons. It would be great if everybody was using one protocol to transfer value. Just like it'd be great if everybody was speaking the same language, or I guess it would be great if everybody lived in the same nation state. But so do you ultimately then not see there being one big cryptocurrency that everybody adopts because of human nature, this tendency for people to break off into tribes and to want things their own way?
I think that we are seeing two forces that are pervasive in all patterns that we see in the universe, that are the tendency for things to clump together and for things to become sparse. So if I take an evolutionary analysis to how I see the evolution of the different currencies, blockchains, languages, countries, I wouldn't be comfortable saying that, yeah, we will end up with having one single language that we're going to use, or one world government, or one single blockchain or protocol that we're going to use, because there will always be things at the rims of the system that don't feel catered by what the system provides, be it a way of expressing or a way of coordinating people, or the properties of these decentralized protocols for transferring value. So some people may say, well, these are very nice properties, but I want these other properties that this system is not providing. So what I could imagine is either more descriptive languages that allow for protocols to be implemented with them, and that could become the one meta protocol that everyone is using. Or what we see is an effort towards interoperability, so that each community keeps developing the tools that they deem suitable for their needs. Because this is another interesting discussion, which is different currencies are trying to solve different problems. And this touches directly with ethics. Why do we want to have these properties in these systems? What are we preventing with it? Why do we want it? And some people may not care about some properties that some other currencies are providing. So why not giving the freedom for people to have the best tools that serve their needs, and then figure out how we can build bridges between these economic platforms or communities. I think that's more likely what we're going to end up seeing, because it's also what we see around us. We see translators, we see all these bridges between communities, languages, and economic platforms.
So you're saying like technologies like cross-atomic swaps and whatever, things that allow different chains to potentially communicate, things like that. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And well, there are many experimentation in this field as well. You have Cosmos, Polkadot that are trying to, how do we have these, in principle, non-compatible systems that are at the end allowing for people to transfer value and so arrange their economic affairs? How do we bridge this gap? Because otherwise it's going to be very messy. And if we talk about mass adoption, well, it will hardly come if it's very difficult for people to use a more niche currency for buying their coffee. In that regard, maybe it happens so that at the end we end up with one currency that takes most of the cake, and everything else is just breadcrumbs.
Yeah, I guess what's also unique and interesting about it is, it's not just a protocol for communicating, but like we said, it's a protocol for communicating value, and that comes with its own network effects. So a protocol for communication has network effects, but then on top of that, if you're saying you're trying to create the world's money, that has its own network effect.
Yeah.
So I think there are, especially a lot of Bitcoin maximalists, for example, make that argument that because of the network effects of money itself, that it will tend towards one protocol.
And you may say that, well, the dollar is the predominant currency in global affairs, but that doesn't mean that other currencies have also a role to play in this global economy. So I don't think there will be just one. Maybe one takes a lot of economic activity happening in it. But then I would also be concerned with other projects that are going to be very successful and maybe they don't have the same community approach. Libra comes to mind. They may be very successful as well, and they may become very widely adopted very quickly. So I don't know. I want to think. I'm optimistic that people will stay in experimenting with different currencies and not going to the shinier one, because I think the shinier one will hardly be based on the principles that initiated this whole movement.
That's interesting. Oh, because you're saying just the shinier one in this case being Bitcoin, obviously.
Now, the shinier one might be things that are not community driven, because this is also about how do we make open source sustainable. And it's not clear that we have found ways to do so. If we look at the Linux kernel, it's sustained by companies that build a profit-seeking enterprise on top, and they keep developing it. Or you can go on the other end of the spectrum and look at free software. This is a gift. This is what we're doing because we think it's important. And I think at the beginning, Bitcoin had a little bit of that, although now it has attracted enough commercial activity so that some players it's on their best interest to maintain and keep developing the protocol. So in the same sense, I'm saying that the more capital is depending on this infrastructure to work properly, the more incentive they have to keep maintaining it. And I wonder what will happen if big players that already have tremendous amount of capital and start funneling them into systems that provide similar properties as we are seeing in Bitcoin, Ethereum, Monero. And that's why I was mentioning Libra. This is the first attempt that we are seeing. It's Facebook saying, well, this seems to be a technical possibility. So what will happen if we go there and try something with it? And that's what I mean, that these companies have huge engineering teams, legal teams, UX teams, and they will make something that looks really shiny that people will start using right away. And people will not think about the underlying principles that are sustaining these economic platforms. So that's why I'm saying that I hope that we don't go for the shiniest one, because the shiniest one I don't think it will be based on the same principles that triggered this whole movement.
Yeah, no, I understand you now. Sorry, I misunderstood you before. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we're already kind of seeing a rejection of the concept of Facebook coin, even among regulators, not for different reasons, but it seems like for this stuff to work, it needs to be truly decentralized and not owned by a company, even for it to get around, regulations, so to speak, and to not give one company too much power. So I guess the hope is that, a company like Facebook won't even be able to get a project like that off the ground.
We'll see what happens. But they're riding on the same wave of decentralization. Their association is companies incorporated in different countries. So even from the regulatory point of view, it's hard to grasp, and that's why some regulators are raising voice of concerns, because are we sure that we can handle this thing that will be put there in the wild for people to use? And yeah, definitely it will be decentralized, but some things of it will be centralized, some things will not. It's going to be a closed group of people that can decide how the protocol evolves. So if they become an economic platform, then so what leverage do these people have on how the rules of the system evolve? And that's the risk. That's the concern we have in other types of blockchains that try to make things very shiny.
All right. Well, it was very nice talking to you, Oweme. We'll put a link to your talk from earlier today in our show notes so people could go back and watch that. I said, I thought it was a great talk. Very interesting take on the forking situation, and I thought it was a great explanation.
Thank you. I think it's a difficult talk, and I hope that I plan to refine this presentation and hopefully drill down even further into some of the nuances of forks.
Yeah, I urge you to, because I know in your talk you gave examples of Bitcoin and Ethereum. The famous Ethereum fork with, I guess, when the DAO failed.
Yeah.
But yeah, I urge you to look more closely at Monero as well, and hopefully maybe as an example of a community that's figured out how not to fork. So like I said, Monero does upgrades every 6 months, which essentially is a fork, but it's one wherein the community all agrees to move over to the upgraded software.
So I think these are very interesting topics, and I hope that I have more time to spend studying them. So maybe in the future we can talk again.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you. You too.
Bye. All right, Francisco, thanks for coming on.
You're very welcome.
How's the conference going?
Well, for me, it's going very well. I mean, it's my first time at a 36C3, so it's a really nice venue. They've done a very good job overall, and I'm actually quite impressed with the work that was done by the cluster and by Riyadh, and so they did a really good job. So that was nice.
What is it like?
What
is it like compared to DEF CON? Is it a similar scene?
It's different in that it's way more hacker friendly. It's more informal and creative. So it's not as structured as DEF CON. So that's I really think that I like. I mean, the design of the space allows people to sort of do their thing, to create a comfortable environment, to create a much more creative environment. So those things I think are really useful in that respect. I really like that aspect of it, the creativity. So it's less formal, it's less corporate in a sense. You want to think of it that way too. This is more in its actual element.
Are you meeting people involved in the Monero project that you haven't met elsewhere?
Well, that was, of course, one of my objectives in coming down here. I'm meeting people that I have met maybe online, but not in person. And I always feel it's very valuable to meet the actual people in person. So, of course, from my perspective, that was a key objective, to actually meet a lot of people that I wouldn't normally be meeting, and to create that presence in Europe. I mean, that's important. So that's a key objective for me in that respect. And I like that. I mean, because I think it's very protective for the project that people that are sort of well known in the project, quote unquote, they're out there, they're reachable. You can interact with them personally, you can ask them questions, that kind of thing.
So before we get into your talk, I guess a question about the recent news that came from the Monero core team, which was Fluffy Pony Ricardo no longer being the lead maintainer. What's your take on that? What should our reaction be? What should the community's reaction be to that?
An evolution of the project. I mean, I think it recognizes the fact the project has grown. It creates redundancy because he's going to be a backup maintainer where there wasn't redundancy before. It's part of the decentralization of the project. It's just part of the normal evolution of the project. That you have that extra back. I mean, and it was much more than just that. I mean, we had also a lot more you're creating a more resilient solution than what we had before, and I think that's part of it. I also think that people, you want to. I mean, I think Ricardo understands very well his role and how to optimize it. If you want to decentralize, well, that's part of it, but he's not going away in another way. In many ways, what he's doing now may actually be more work than what he did back in 2014, because the size of the project is like it's 1,000 times in size and capitalization alone. So this is, these things evolve, and I think there has to be that sort of spread of responsibility and centralization. That's just part of the process.
So is this something that like the core team was talking about? Were you guys aware of it, or were there discussions?
Oh yeah, yeah, it was discussed and decisions were made, and basically the idea was to continue with the decentralization role and to essentially create resiliency within the project, and that's exactly what it's doing. We're stronger as a result of this. But I would be a bit remiss saying that Ricardo is totally leaving the project. That's not correct. It's more that he is taking a different role.
Right. He's still going to be, I think, even the backup maintainer, right?
Well, he's the backup maintainer. That's why I said I create original resiliency, because now you've got two people instead of one, so you actually make the situation stronger.
Yeah, no, I mean, my interpretation was all positive. I just wanted to get your take on it and understand what the core team's take on it was.
Yeah, that was basically the idea.
Okay. So today you gave a talk on block size, the dynamic block weight. I'm sorry. So I guess that is the first question. What is the difference between block size and block weight?
Okay, this is one that actually a lot of people can be caught off guard on. I mean, Blockweight was introduced in Monero with the advent of bulletproofs. And the reason it was done is because in a bulletproof, the size scales as the log, like the size of the proof, scales as the log of the number of outputs. And the log base too, when I'm saying log. While the verification time scales linearly with the number of outputs. So the idea is that you want to price that verification time where you have to find a way to have a linear scaling with number of outputs in the pricing. So that's why we created the block weight, which essentially what it does is you take the space savings from, say, an 8 output transaction over the 2 output transaction. You then take that 80% of the savings, you add it back to the block size to create the block weight, and then you price, i.e. the penalty and the fees, etc., on the basis of the block weight rather than the block size. So what is happening, even though the transaction is smaller in the actual blockchain, you're paying this premium for the fact that you have the extra verification. That's essentially the concept. And it really only kicks in when the transaction has more than 2 outputs. But that's why block weight was put in there.
And so how did you guys arrive at that exact architecture? Was there...
Well, the idea was to create a pricing for this verification time, which was scaling linearly. And so the concept was, well, you got to take a fair amount of it back, but you got to leave something on the table. So there's still an incentive to use the separate outputs because it's more efficient. But you have to pay for at the same time for the verification time, because the verification time it scales with linear as opposed to log. And that's essential. So it's a trade-off between the two. And the concept, and I came up with the term clawback, which is kind of interesting. It's actually the way the Canadian federal government treats pensions. They give you a pension. If you make a certain amount of money, they take a percentage of it back and they call it a clawback. And that's essentially what happens here. I mean, you're saying, okay, fine, you're not going to get all of the benefit of the savings in space and cost. We're going to claw some of it back to compensate for this verification. That's essentially what it is.
Do you see that ever being further adjusted or tweaked, or have we kind of arrived at where we need to be with dynamic block weight?
Well, the minute you change the underlying reason, and that is the way you do the proof. So a lot of what's been in the pipeline, you have to look at the parameters at that point in time. And if there is a discrepancy between verification time and size, then you've got to more likely keep this kind of model. If on the other hand, you went to a system where both verification time and size was the same, scaled the same way, then you go back to block size. So what you're pricing is this different, and it's totally dependent upon the actual technology that you're using at the proof level. So the mathematics of the proofs and how they behave, how much space they take, how much time does it take to verify. That's what drives this phenomenon. So it's very much technically related to the actual type of proof.
So we haven't really ever seen dynamic block size, block weight in action yet, though, right? I mean,
Yes, we have.
Okay. What point?
And believe it occurred. Well, first of all, right at the very beginning, there was an attack in 2014 that actually had the dynamic block size at the time in action. That's very, very early days. And it all worked the way it was supposed to. Then we had I believe in 2018, there was a point where it went up to 400,000 and it just worked exactly the way it's supposed to work. So it goes up and then it lays down. Then there was the time when there was a problem with it, which was when we still had, before bulletproofs, before we had bulletproofs, and we had 13.5K transactions, but we had a very small minimum block size, and we kept getting stuck, and that we needed to change that. And that was one case where it did run into trouble. And the reason it ran into trouble is because the ratio between the transaction size, which is what I call the sort of reference transaction size, and the penalty-free block size was too high. Right now it's below 1%, and that's where it should be. If you increase the transaction size for the average, then you've got to also take a look at that block size. And if you don't increase it, you can create a situation where then it becomes very expensive to transact. And that's what happened just before we went to the 300,000 byte block size.
Howard Chu, I think it was Howard Chu that I saw make a comment on Reddit not so long ago, talking about Monero's throughput versus Bitcoin's throughput. Mm-hmm. Basically saying, in essence, that Monero may have a larger throughput than Bitcoin if you take into account the need for Bitcoin to essentially do additional transactions to make their coins fungible and private, whereas in Monero, it's built into the protocol. Do you have any opinion there on that concept?
Well, the throughput and how many transactions per second Monero can support?
Yeah, and then if you take into account that with Bitcoin, if you want to use Bitcoin correctly, every time it's not just making a transaction, but then there's additional transactions that need to be made to essentially obtain what's obtained naturally with Monero in each transaction.
Okay, let me step here for a second. Monero, with its privacy functions, outcompetes Bitcoin on this matter without privacy.
Okay, so ignoring privacy.
Ignoring privacy entirely. You just accept the penalty that the transaction time is 5 times bigger. You're going to have way higher throughput in Monero than you have in Bitcoin, simply because of the fact that they have a fixed block size limit. So they're stuck. And they have to keep it small in order to be able to pay for the miners. Now, what Howard Chu's mentioning is, on top of that, you're comparing, and he's right, you're comparing apples and oranges, because Monero's already factoring the privacy, and if you want to do privacy on top of that in Bitcoin, then you're going to have a much higher cost because it's way less efficient. And that is true. The minute you do Wasabi Wallet and you try to mix and all this kind of stuff, you're going to have a much more inefficient approach to privacy, so it's actually going to be bigger for less privacy. You don't get the efficiency there. But the fundamental problem that people forget here. Now, I'll give you another example. Take Bitcoin Cash. They think they have a 32 megabyte 32 megabyte block size. That is actually smaller when you take into account Nielsen's law than when Bitcoin's 1 megabyte block size was back in 2010. So if you look at how much bandwidth has increased in that period of time, the last 9.5 years, you already have a smaller block size in Bitcoin Cash than you had in Bitcoin back in 2010. And we're talking a factor of about 38. The privacy function, what we're talking about here, is about 5. So between comparing Monero's privacy with no privacy at all in Bitcoin, the cost of Monero's privacy is 5. That's been wiped out just by Nielsen's law and the successors to Moore's law, things such as three-dimensional shapes and where all the technology is going. So that just totally wiped that issue out. Yes, Monero is less suitable because of the privacy overhead, but that's minimal compared to what really is driving this, which is technology.
Is there any way to actually, or has anybody quantified these things in a digestible way where you can essentially compare apples to oranges here? So, kind of boiling it down to, because obviously Monero and Bitcoin are both very different animals, but it's hard to quantify and describe the comparison of throughput given their different architecture.
You can, in the sense that you have to accept the transaction size. So if you look at the first problem is you're comparing apples and oranges to the privacy side. So what are we going to do? We're going to do Wasabi Wallet on Bitcoin. Well, we're going to probably need a lot of mixing of Wasabi Wallet to try to compensate for the fact that you do not have confidential transactions, or you do not have stealth addresses for starters. So right off the get-go, your coin mixing is horrendously inefficient and subject to tracking because you have transaction problems. So now you have a way less inefficient privacy model, and then you're going to turn around and say, well, we're going to compare to Monero's. Well, if you try to simulate what Monero does, you're way behind in Bitcoin. So you are comparing apples and oranges. There's no two ways about it. But probably a better example would be to look at, say, if you take the privacy equation totally out, then of course you would look at Dogecoin versus Bitcoin, and you would have put Monero's scaling technology onto Dogecoin, and then make a comparison. And then you can say, of course, in Monero's market, you're limited by the technology. But the technology's goalposts keep moving. So what you're limited by in Monero today is not what you're going to be limited by in Monero 10 years from now. But Bitcoin is got stuck on this 1 megabyte limit because basically they have to keep it small in order to cause the fees to go up so they can take care of the falling block reward. At the other side of the equation, you've got Bitcoin Satoshi Vision. So what are they doing? Well, let's create humongous blocks with any and every kind of data on the blockchain because we need to sell the space to compensate for the miners. So they both have a problem, which has nothing to do with privacy. And it is to do with the scaling problem. Now, yes, Monero has to pay a price for excellent privacy, but that's minimal compared to what we're dealing with here.
What kind of transaction volume can Monero handle today? Obviously, it works for its purposes today, given the amount of users that are using it. It's very cheap to send transactions. If the world turned on, woke up tomorrow and said, hey, Monero is what we need to use to transact on the internet, would Monero be able to handle it? To what degree would it be able to handle it?
Well, basically, it will hit the limit. The limit that you would have is a technological limit, and the test there has been on Bitcoin SV, where they're doing 200 megabyte block in 10 minutes. So you could say, well, if they could prove that, then Monero should be able to do in 10 minutes equivalent amount of transactions. That's one way to look at it, but that's at that point in time. And they had all sorts of other issues. But yes, theoretically, it really depends. Then you say, what can it do 10 years, 5 years from now? Well, it's going to be whatever Nielsen's law and the successors to Moore's law are going to allow. So you have this goalpost that's moving all the time. So I think realistically, you could probably take a look at what other chains has done, and I think what Bitcoin SV has done in testing these sites, very large blocks, and get an idea to what the limits would be from the current technology. Because they've tested it on their chain already. They're pushing the limit because they need to fill their chain up with all sorts of stuff in order to try to pay for the miners. So they have that's how they're trying to deal with the fee problem. So if you look at what they're doing, then that'll give you an idea where your technological limits are at one point in time. Ultimately, what's going to happen is you could, in principle, increase the orphan rate, and then we're into Peter Rissen's work, which essentially adds a second term to the penalty to account for the fact that minors have a higher probability of orphan, so they're going to restrict. I mean, you could approach it that way. And that is driven, again, by the Blockweight, but it's the same formula. It's like an exponential term, so that could limit, and that would be that technological limit we're just talking about. But once you take that out, you're limited by how fast you allow scaling to happen in the blockchain.
Do you think Monero will kind of always stay ahead in terms of where it needs to be in scaling and what its actual adoption is? I mean, right now, I think we're obviously at that stage, right? So Monero can handle its user base now. Do you think it will hit a wall, or it will always be able to kind of?
I don't think so. No, I think the growth is going to be organic. I also think that Monero is the only coin right now that has dealt with something as basic as how do you deal with transaction variability. And by that, I'm talking about transaction volume variability. Now, if you look at the Christmas season in North America and in Europe, you have a peak in December 23rd, and you have a crash in transaction volumes on December 25th. And if you look at Visa statistics, and they have exactly the same problem whether centralized or decentralized. I mean, everybody wants to go and buy their Christmas present on December 23rd, and there's a surge right at the end. So if they're using Monero or they're using Visa, you're going to get the same ratio between the average transaction level on retail and the peak transaction level. And this is why we have this 50 times factor in between and built into Monero. We're the only coin that's done that. Nobody has even looked at this issue. How do you deal with a burst in transaction? I mean, this is over a period of, say, a month, when in fact your overall growth is going to be way lower. And nobody's even looked at this question. And we're the only coin that's implemented it already. So that we're way ahead of the game on scaling.
What do you? Is there anything that you're excited for right now, Monero, coming up? That's on the roadmap?
I mean, right now it's a question, I think, of awareness. I mean, my opinion is this issue of scaling in Monero, really, there's a lack of awareness about it, even within the community. A lot of people seem to be under the misunderstanding that we scale worse than Bitcoin, and we have to sort of compete with Bitcoin on whatever privacy attempts they're doing. And I'm saying, no. I mean, I'm saying privacy is part of Monero. Yes, we're going to pay a 5-time transaction size on it. It'll go down maybe 5 to 6 to maybe 4 to 5, and then it'll be made more efficient, but maybe we'll invest a bit more in privacy. But that's de minimis. It's minimal or long term when you're dealing with the technological change. Just like comparing sending a telegram and sending an email. I mean, that's the kind of the way you need to think about it. So the long term is fundamentally very, very solid for Monero. And the interesting thing is because we're the only coin that's really addressed the problem of long-term fees. Nobody else has done it with the exception of Dogecoin, and they could probably basically take our technology and put it on their chain. But when it comes to Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV and Dash and Litecoin and Zcash, they've all got this maximum number of coins. So they're all going to hit protocol limits and privacy that got nothing to do with what the technology can support. Mm-hmm. And it's a matter of time.
Are there any talks that you're particularly interested in listening to at the conference?
Well, there's a few that I'm interested in. Now that I have a bit more time, I'm focused on my... I'm no longer concerned about focusing on my own talks, so now I'm looking into learn about the whole what's happening here and so on. So a lot of very interesting stuff. There's a lot of very interesting work being done on free software, on broader issues of end user security and all. There's a ton of things that's happening here in that respect. So there's a lot of stuff that I'll be looking around on the workshops and so on. One thing that I kind of got my attention is the replicant in Android, because Android is very much controlled at the device level right now, and that's something I have a big problem with. So those type of things are really interesting. I mean, one point that I would make is if you're looking at something like Monero, the security of Monero is only as good as the end user security. So if you compromise the device, there goes your privacy. You can do all these great things on the network, but if the device has got a hole in it, well, the privacy's gone. That's a good example of what I'm talking about. So you need a secure device.
Definitely. So at the 36C3, obviously everybody there, for the most part, is part of this culture of respecting digital privacy and trying to build tools to help enable protections of privacy. Do you see that conversation becoming more mainstream now in 2020?
Well, yes. I mean, one only needs to see. I think there's more awareness. There's more awareness internationally about the issue of privacy. There's awareness in America, for example, with the law in California with respect to privacy. There's big awareness. A very interesting response is the kind of very negative response that Facebook Libra got from regulators almost across the world. That's a real indicator that people are waking up to some of the issues. I think it's because it's perceived of its weakness in privacy overall. So also there's a lot more awareness about this. One thing that I would like to point out, what kind of bothers me sometimes with Monero, is people are missing, when they look at a regulation, for example, they don't actually read it. So, well, how is it really impacting Monero, for example? As opposed to saying, blindly assuming that it will. And there's a few threads that I've seen that kind of thing.
Yeah,
so I think it's
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of FUD and misunderstanding out there as to what the actual regulations are and what effect they're going to have on Monero, and our exchanges delisting Monero because of it. What is your overall take there? On regulation and how it's going to affect Monero in the coming years?
Well, I think right now what I've seen from the regulators is not particularly negative to Monero, but the FUD around it has been very significantly negative. And that gets to the point where, for example, it may influence decisions such as an exchange listing because of how regulation is interpreted. And a great example of this has occurred. I mean, there was one that came out in France. They had a very extensive report. There was a minority opinion by the president that says, well, these are the things that I thought should have been done, one of which was to target private cryptocurrencies. But that didn't make it into the final report. What made it, the recommendations were not what was that. Everybody focused on this minority comment saying, well, France is going to ban private cryptocurrencies. No, that's not what the report said. It was considered by one or two members, and it was decided that didn't go in the final recommendation. And that's the kind of thing that we need to make those subtle distinctions. There's another case in Canada, actually more familiar would be the case in the United States with the proposed legislation. Now, there what they did is they called it crypto commodities rather than cryptocurrencies, and then they applied very strict regulations to cryptocurrencies. So they take Monero and they call it a crypto commodity. They give it essentially a level of very favorable regulation. The same thing with Bitcoin. Then they take a whole bunch of other coins, including Facebook Libra. They call it a cryptocurrency, and they hit it hard with regulation. And then everybody runs around and assumes that the cryptocurrency regulation applies to the crypto commodities, i.e. Bitcoin and Monero, and there's a ton of FUD around it. Well, read the thing. If it's decentralized, it's a crypto commodity, not a cryptocurrency. And that's what we have to keep in mind. We have to actually read the actual case. Then there was a case in Canada where they were dealing with the GST, which is like a Canadian version of VAT. And again, the legislation exempted Bitcoin and Monero and so on, but hit hard certain types of stablecoins. Well, you got to make that distinction. What exactly are they doing? So that's what I'm saying. When it comes to regulation, I always like to start by reading the regulation itself and then form an opinion, because a lot of what is coming out is not really what the regulation says.
Do you think it also could potentially bring more attention to Monero? So regulation, obviously not the best thing if it's going to reduce liquidity, making it more difficult for people to obtain Monero on exchanges. But could it also have the opposite effect, kind of bringing attention to Monero as people see it more in the news and see that they're, governments are talking about it. Just this discussion of regulation in cryptocurrencies and Monero in particular, could that potentially have a positive effect on increasing the mind share of Monero?
Well, it could, in the sense that, it creates awareness, but it also, I think there's a danger if there's misunderstanding of thought. So it's kind of a both, a positive and a negative. I think lack of awareness of Monero is very significant. I do sense that there's a very strong support on what I would consider the smart money. Very good example of that would have been Daniel's talk, his keynote, where he covered a lot of that element. So definitely there is that element. That's kind of the vibes that I'm getting. But at the same time, you have a lot of FUD running around. I think that's hurting. Awareness in general is a good thing in the long term. I think also another area that will impact Monero very significantly is that there's going to be stiff regulations against mixers and opt-in privacy, mainly because it's easy to do. And the classic example, we saw it when an exchange says, if you want privacy, get a privacy coin. Because otherwise you're going to be in trouble. I have some serious concerns about things like Wasabi Wallet and Bitcoin, Cash Fusion and Cash Shuffle and Bitcoin Cash, etc. These kind of things are easy to target by chain analysis companies, etc. So they will target it.
Yeah, and it's easier to make the assumption that anybody that's using a mixer has something to hide, is trying to, clean their tainted coins. Whereas people that are using Monero, since it's private by default, you can't make that assumption.
Well, I think what you have is a very simple statistical probability that if you have coins that have gone through, in Monero, what you get is basically the average percentage. Whatever percentage is dark money, that's what you're going to get. In Bitcoin, on the other hand, you're going to get a selection for dark money in a mixer. Because the people that are going to mix it are those that are really, and also when you consider the way that it's actually being used, is that when you consider the way it's used, you have a pre-selection towards dark money in a mixer and Bitcoin that you do not get in Monero. So statistically, if you're doing an analysis probability risk management for MLNYC, Monero is going to have a fraction of the risk that, say, a mixed Bitcoin ever will. For that reason, because it's selectively going for the group, and that's the danger.
All right.
And I think that's the point that was made with respect to that exchange.
All right. I think we'll leave it at that. Thanks again, Francisco.
Sounds
it's always
good.
a pleasure having you on. We'll link to your full talk in the show notes when we post this. Obviously, encourage everybody to watch that. All right. We'll be in touch.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for joining us on this week's episode. We release new episodes every week. You can find and subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have an Alexa device, you can tell it to listen to the latest episode of the Monero Talk podcast. Go to monerotalk.live/subscribe for a full list of places where you can watch and listen. If you want to interact with us, guests, or other podcast listeners, you can follow us on Twitter. And please leave us a review on iTunes. It helps people find the show, and we are always happy to read them. So thanks so much, and we look forward to being back next week.